So my name is James Crabtree from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and I am here today with Anna Kinberg Batra, who is a Swedish MP for the Moderate Party, as well as a fellow at the Stockholm School of Economics. And we're going to talk about populism. The rise of populism has been one of the defining narratives of politics in the West in particular, but also to some degree here in Asia, where we're sitting in Goa in India. It is partly seen as a factor of an aftermath of the global financial crisis and the sense that for large swathes of voters across Western societies, times are not as good as they were. But it's also intimately bound up in issues of cultural identity and a transition between generations, between the kind of coming force of the youth and those that have gone before and the reaction against them. And so we're going to try and tease these issues out as they have been seen in the Brexit referendum, in the election of Donald Trump, but also across Europe, from Viktor Orban in Hungary to Turkey, and indeed even in Scandinavia. And so that's where we'll start. So let me turn to Anna. And I suppose maybe we can kick off our conversation. Tell us a little bit about your own background in Sweden. And I mean, Sweden is almost the last place one would think that there would be a populist uprising. This is almost the spiritual home of social democracy, social equality, and yet even in Sweden there has been a rise in populist sentiment. So maybe tell us a little of your own background and the background of this in Sweden.
Thank you, James. I'm very happy to be here, I must say. Batra is, of course, an Indian name, and my husband is of Indian origin, so I'm especially happy to have this conversation here. But yes, I'm former party leader of the Moderate Party in Sweden, and which, as well as the Social Democrats and other traditional European parties, are now struggling really with the rise of populism. I think it would rather have three main driving forces that we could discuss. One being fundamental real-world changes. As you pointed out and started with, obviously the industrial society and its institutions are being challenged by globalization, digitalization, robotization, AI and the like. Mm-hmm. And you have the global migration crisis with, 65 million people involuntarily displaced, and so on. You have conflicts around the world. The world is at some sort of crossroads. That's driving force number one that makes people, of course, wonder what is happening to me, and especially after the decades of globalization. Also, those who had a safe job before will see their jobs going away and their leaders not providing good answers to what's happening instead. So there is a route really for maybe miscontent, but at least worrying about what's happening around you in the world. And then you have route number two, I think, to populism, which really is the established political leaders' failure to respond to this. So you see a change in the political landscape. You see a shift from identity politics, classical social democrats in Sweden, my party as well, that I led, who were in government for a long time and trusted and trustworthy and stable and so on. These are now being challenged, and voters' preferences in the US, around in Europe, are turning into other parties who do something else. And what something else is can be different. There is the anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim often extremism, but there is also left-wing populism, like Corbyn in the UK, mm-hmm. And like some other leaders as well. And there are, of course, Podemos in Spain or Macron in France, that came from, quite middle-of-the-road reform agendas, but in another way than used to be the ground rule. So the party political landscape is shifting away from what was before. And then the third factor that makes it even more difficult than to act as an old established party during this time is that the media landscape and how we communicate are also changing. Mm-hmm. I was also a journalist for a brief time, 2 summers, at one of the leading Swedish dailies. Then a media day was 24 hours. And you woke up in the morning and you had a topic that lasted throughout the day or into the evening news, and then you went to sleep and something else happened the next day, or maybe even not. And now you have immediate global broadcast of anything that happens immediately through all the social media, through the mobiles around the world. So big news, big shocks are immediately spread to everyone. And the winners in this landscape are other voices and other means of communication than the traditional parties were. Mm-hmm. So Financial Times are still around, but they're also more digitally based now. And we see then that voters and movements, single issue movements, populist movements, strong personalities are easier to get their voice heard in this landscape than were the traditional institutions. So those three, real world changes, political landscape changes, as well as changes in how we communicate, put new challenges on anyone, journalists and politicians.
So we have a number of factors that we think lie behind the kind of populist explosion, different maybe in each country. In this part of the world, so again, we're sitting in India. I live in Singapore. I did live in India as a journalist. You see slightly fewer examples of populist leaders in this, but you still have Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, to some degree Narendra Modi in India, the longer he has been in office, has also had a kind of populist streak to him. His experiment in demonetization, where almost all of India's bank currency was removed overnight and replaced in an anti-corruption drive, had a strong populist tinge to it. But sort of sticking to the West, and I mean, I'd like to know a little more about the precise trajectory of what happened in Sweden. So I simply don't know which is the populist party or are the populist parties. You are a moderate, and so it's not you. But what are they, and what has been the result of the populist upsurge in Sweden?
Now, at the last general elections, 2014, the moderate party and its coalition lost government power, not because we were doing bad. I mean, others be the judge of that, and clearly the voters ousted us. But what really happened then was the end of identity politics, or the peak of identity politics, and Swedish voters feeling quite okay, the economy doing fine, the country stable, almost on the verge of boring. But many voters wanted something else to happen. Some of them voted for left-wing populism of sorts. There are different types of that. But the main movement was to the Sweden Democrats, which is a very nice name for quite a nasty party, though, with the roots in the neo-Nazi movement of Sweden. And since that is what this is about, this party has been isolated from the established political scene since they first entered parliament in 2010. Everyone, feared them, hated their values and roots, and draw the conclusion that we should keep them out. But by doing so, in hindsight, one must admit that allowed them to grow. They have doubled since in the elections of 14. And we kept isolating them in the first few years of this, after 14 then, 15, 16. And they kept growing, and they kept taking the position of the outsiders vis-à-vis the establishment, which they could, of course, also claim.
This is a point that is made by the political scientist Yasha Monk, who's written on the decline of democracy, that one of the kind of paradoxes of populism is that when populist forces emerge, the traditional elite, the insiders, of whom you are one, and I suppose I am also one, they tend to kind of rally against the foe. And actually, paradoxically, that tends to make people more popular because it defines them as outsiders. And if you are a classic populist party attempting to foment a mass movement against the established powers, that can be quite helpful. And so this creates a real problem, which is how do you combat populism? You can only do it in a long-term sense by addressing its underlying causes. If you attempt to do what you did in Sweden, then often you fail because of what you do.
Yeah. So first we failed from isolating them, and then I took office after us losing the elections. Started out in isolating them as we have done before. They have the same roots, the same values. I've founded my family with a man of foreign background. I'm very anti-racist and really hate their values, I must say. However, we also saw them grow, and when we kept isolating them, they grew and grew and grew. So we know that that won't work. And when I talk to other political leaders in the Nordic countries, if you see Denmark, if you see Finland, if you see Norway, what they did was to treat them more, hold them accountable, I should say, like other political parties. The former Communist Party, for example, in Sweden, well, I hate their values too. Look around the world what communism has done to people. It's not an ideology I support at all. But I would talk to a former Communist Party member or their party leader even, if there is something we have in common. I would never govern with them because we share too little values. And so I came to the conclusion, my leadership came to the conclusion that we need to stop isolating them and start treating them as other parties, meaning holding them accountable for what they say and do, not start cooperating, not start governing with them, but stop isolating and demonizing, if you will. Because through the demonizing, we just let them grow. This, I believe, was the right thing to do, but I failed in doing so. That is really the main root to why I lost my party leadership position, because we got hit quite badly in the polls by the other elites, namely the media, basically, who then could demonize me instead.
So the point was that in attempting to what would be called accommodate or potentially even appease these extremist forces, you were then criticized for going too far, and people said you should be standing up to these people, and you weren't. Was that the sort of thing that happened?
Basically, that was what the debate came about. I would deny appeasing myself. I was not making any plans of governing with them or going into building a platform with them or anything like that at all. But it was a bit interpreted that way, which hit me very badly. If you compare to Erna Solberg of Norway, who is now Prime Minister for a sister party, she also was hit quite badly in the polls, and she now governs with the Fremskrittspartiet of Norway, which is a party with other rules, other roots, of course. That is a party with other roots,
right.
more happy populism, if you will. So it's still my conviction that the Sweden Democrats shouldn't be a government party, but neither should the Communist Party or the former Communist Party be.
I mean, it's interesting. So for people in Asia, where, again, the populist wave that has hit Europe and North America is not felt here in quite the same way. I mean, to some degree, as I say, there are some populist leaders and there are populist parties, populist moments, but it hasn't occurred in quite the same way. And so there are some lessons to be had here, I suppose, in terms of how you try and deal with these forces. And so, I mean, I suppose you identified let's say there are two potential causes of populism. I'll leave your point about the media to one side, one of which is economic dissatisfaction. That tends to be the one that we go to first, which is, things haven't been that great, people are slightly angry. But then you also put your finger on this issue of kind of culture and identity. And so Ronald Inglehart and Pippa Norris, two of the kind of leading scholars of populism, claim that actually that's much more important, that this is really a reaction against racial change, cultural change, a sort of change in society where the elites have become post-materialist, cosmopolitan, liberal, pro-gay, all sorts of things to do with values. And in Europe, that is particularly true around the issue of immigration, which is the sort of lightning rod for a lot of this. But the reason why people are dissatisfied about immigration is thought to be because that illustrates a much deeper anxiety about kind of identity, place in the world, to some degree race. I wonder, what's been your experience of that balance? You said that in Sweden, it was quite boring, the economy was doing fine. And so you seem to be saying that actually this cultural point was the real root of things. And if so, is that right? And if so, what do you do about that? I mean, because if you go to the economic explanation, you can say, all right, well, we'll have a traditional social democratic response. We'll give people more money. We'll give them more social support. The state will provide answers. But what do you do about anxiety about identity that will give people a sense of greater meaning and security? This is a horribly difficult policy problem.
I think both are true. in a sense, because in the Western world, in the US and Europe, of course, there is the history of we used to be rich. The blue-collar man used to be able to get a good job without going to university, living where he once was born and grew up, and doing fine, and start a family and just lead a good life if he had his health. That seems so easy compared to what a 17, 18-year-old man or woman is facing if you grew up in a tiny town, especially in the countryside today. Today, you would need to go to university, you would need to move. The old factory that you could depend on and your parents could depend on might have shut down. And that is, of course, this is for real. That's true in the US and in Western Europe. So in that sense, the economical thing is there. Now, Sweden didn't have the real incomes not rising problem like in the US, but the same sentiment among especially the blue-collar voters. And so anger building up from bad prospects on the labor market and the elites not understanding my difficulties back home. That is true. And I think the other one is also true, the identity thing. Yes, the economy was strong and people started looking for other means of voting. If you look at World Values Survey, for example, you would see that Sweden, decades ago, 1980 or so, we were not particularly extreme in values. We were there in the middle. We were a bit. We believed in the state. We trusted institutions and each other and so on. And then we moved in a few decades to just a few years ago. Then we moved to the extreme upper right-hand side end of the diagram in World Values Survey, being the world's extreme country in being both secular and individualistic, believing in oneself instead of, institutions, families, tribes, what have you. So very strong individualism at the same time as we have high levels of trust in institution and still high expectancy for government to fix things for us. And then when government doesn't, when you have queues for healthcare or schools don't work or you don't get a job, then you turn angry, which makes perfect sense, in a sense. And then politicians need to provide a serious response to that in a language that you can understand.
So if you're sitting here in Asia, so let's say that I think we agree that lying behind all of this is the conundrum of globalization. And so whether you believe in the economic explanation of populism or the cultural explanation of populism, to some degree, they're both also rooted in globalization.
Yes.
The economic disparity comes from a prosperity of globalization which was not broadly shared, which was predominantly captured by the existing elites. And the cultural anxiety, to some degree, is driven and embodied by an increase in immigration, either within the European Union in a specific case, or just more generally, more people around the world moving for economic and other reasons. So, briefly, as we conclude, if you're sitting looking from Asia and you're thinking about, so we want to nip this populism in the bud, what's the answer? Is the answer less globalization? Or is the answer globalization, but with a different policy response to manage the downsides? What has been your kind of conclusion? Did we, in the 90s and the 2000s, just go kind of crazy with globalization in a way that was unhelpful, and we need to basically dial that back and realize that that was not a good idea, and maybe a little bit of that, but less? Or can you have full stream ahead globalization, but with appropriate managerial responses? What have you come to?
I definitely hope for number two. I mean, if you look back, globalization gave ordinary people around the world the possibilities not only to move, but also to get, household electronics, better food, really, and a better life. Middle-class life has been improved through globalization at affordable prices for middle-class people. And we obviously don't want to lose that. We, however, don't want to lose our jobs to the people manufacturing these cheap goods. And that question is obviously unanswered, because that's a dilemma of course. Now, my answer would never be stop trading, because that would make middle-class life not only more expensive, but also more difficult. That would make jobs fewer. I'm a very strong, most Swedes are of course very strong believers in free trade, but you see also India rising when it's opening up to the world. However, yes, you need better political response, and that includes both what and how you do it. What is about providing security for your people and providing opportunities for those growing up in the town where there's no factory anymore. You need to answer that through reforms of labour markets, through better schools and possibilities to get another job if you lose it in the middle of your life. And if you don't, you have failed a basic contract. So that needs to be done. The how thing is really about, I really believe and hope at least that serious reformers should be able to talk to people and engage emotionally even when people are worried. Now, neither Donald Trump nor Narendra Modi are anti-establishment, not at all. They're president and prime minister. They are the establishment, and Donald Trump came from, well, wealth and money and power. But what they did do differently, despite all the differences, of course, was to tap into what people were thinking and worrying about and provide an answer in a way that they were listened to. So you clearly can. Mr. Macron in France is definitely not anti-establishment at all. He's from the elite, grew up in the elite. He has been a minister in the former president's party, all of that, but has managed to get people to listen to him when he thinks anew on how to reform his country in the world as it is today. Now, can you do this if your party is over 100 years old? Yes, if you adapt to change. But for parties and businesses alike, if you don't manage to act as you need to do in this time and world, then you're in trouble.
Very good. Well, it's a sort of interesting dilemma, isn't it? Typically, often in this part of the world, developing economies are looking at the advanced industrial economies and thinking, well, can we mimic what they have done? This is an example where perhaps there's learning to be done the other way in the sense of how can we avoid the mistakes that have been made in these countries. And so the Swedish example and those from Europe are prime in those examples. So anyway, let's wrap up our conversation there. So thank you very much. That was good.
Thank you.
All right.